So I've turned on the recording. I'm going to pop open my chat window so that if folks have things that they want to put in the chat, I can see it. And we'll go ahead and get started. So I titled this Jewish Standard Time. This is, a lot of you remember that we did something called Texts on Tuesdays for the first year of the pandemic, more or less. And David Wittenberg has stepped in a number of times and done his a history of ancient Israel and Judah, because otherwise you just have to hear me talk all the time, and that's not great. And he's been doing a longer term kind of learning project, whereas I grab little topics. And I've changed the name from Texts on Tuesdays to Thinking Tuesdays so that we can broaden things out a little bit more. Because this is not going to be particularly text-centric necessarily in quite the way Texts on Tuesday tended to be. So this one is called Jewish Standard Time. So we're going to do a series on the Jewish calendar and the holidays and things like that. Because it's nice to go back through them and remember and refresh and all of that kind of thing. So Jewish Standard Time, I'm quite honestly making the joke that people show up late in Jewish settings all the time. So, hey, why not joke about Jewish Standard Time a little bit? So that's what we're doing with the title. And we're really going to talk about the structure of the Jewish calendar, how we get leap months, how we know how many days are in a month, what's going on with the years, what's going on with time during the day, because traditional Jewish ways of figuring time during the day don't rely on a strict 24-hour day in the way that we're accustomed to. So all of this stuff is kind of nice to know, useful to know when thinking about dealing with the calendar, because otherwise it's pretty opaque, right? It's like, well, okay, why is Passover at the end of March this year and was mid-April last year, and next year it's going to be late, and why is there, sometimes there's two of a month, and all kinds of things like that. So we'll talk about all of that and other things too. So our goals will be to learn the origins of the various ways Judaism has of telling time, including months, years, and halachic hours, and we'll get there when we get there. Understand more about how the length of any given Jewish year is determined and why, and this is one of the ones that's kind of mystifying for a lot of people. And then understand the function of timekeeping, the division of the day in traditional Jewish contexts. Judaism has a way of dividing the day into hours, and they don't make sense unless you know what the purpose of it is. And occasionally I've picked a song title. So we're Hazy Shade of Winter because we are technically still in winter. Today is the third day of Nisan 5781, so we'll talk about the months first because that's the hardest one to kind of wrap your hands around. So, big challenge is, if you look at the course of Jewish history, and you look at the Tanakh, right, the Torah, the prophets, and the writings, right, the Bible, there's no place where an entire calendar is presented, right, with these are the months of the year, and this is the season that corresponds to X, Y, or Z. We've got a bunch of different ways of presenting time. So biblical festivals are associated with points of time in the year, but month names aren't used. Usually, you get the first month or the beginning of the months, right? So the first description we have of Passover, going in order of chapters in the Tanakh, is in Exodus 12:2. And it says, this month shall mark for you the beginning of the months. It shall be the first of the months of the year. And then you start to get a description of Passover. And it's only a whole chapter later that we actually get a name for this month. And it just says Aviv, which means spring. So it's not like we have a month name. We've got the name of a season that's connected to a holiday. So we don't know how long Aviv was supposed to be exactly, right? There's a lot that's just missing there. Most biblical texts, when they're talking about when holidays fit in the calendar, they're just going to say the first month, the second month, or the third month. They're not going to say in the month of Nisan, in the month of Adar, in the month of Kislev, right? And we'll see kind of why that is. So we've got that problem. There's not a calendar. There's no calendar that you can just kind of pull out of the text and go, oh, well, this is what they were doing. Events sometimes get dated to the year of a king's reign. So Ahaziah, son of Ahab, had become king of Israel and Samaria in the 17th year of King Jehoshaphat of Judah. He reigned over Israel 2 years, right? King A became king in the 17th year of King B in that other kingdom, and he reigned for 2 years. More precision isn't typical, but it exists, right? So we see there's a story about Jeroboam, a king in the north, not the king in the north, for those of you who are Game of Thrones fans. Jeroboam is a king in the north, and he establishes a festival on the 15th day of the 8th month in imitation of the festival in Judah. We don't know what festival this is, by the way. The best guess is that there was like a second Sukkot maybe that happened, because Sukkot happens in the 7th month in the biblical calendar on the 15th day. So maybe the southern kingdom had a holiday like a second Sukkot a month later. We don't know. Jeroboam is never believed to do anything good by the writer of the Book of Kings, and so doing this is bad. Right? You should know, inventing holidays, bad. Anything anybody in the north does, as far as the Book of Kings is concerned, is bad. So don't make up holidays, is the feeling. And it's actually not clear that there was a single calendar that anybody used. So the Torah talks about months, first month, second month, third month, but it isn't 100% clear that it's a lunar calendar completely. It isn't 100% clear that it's a solar calendar completely. It's not really clear when you look at Exodus 12 and Exodus 13 that they're on the same wavelength as anything else, because Exodus gives a name to the first month of the year. And that doesn't happen anywhere else. And that name doesn't come up anywhere else as the name of a month. So it's very it's a little odd. So it's not clear that there was a single calendar used throughout the whole Torah, which makes sense because not one person wrote the whole Torah. So of course, there's not necessarily a calendar. Every so often, you just have to kind of laugh at Donald Rumsfeld's we have known knowns, known unknowns, and unknown unknowns. And so we have it here at the top of a slide because there's a lot we do and don't know. Is it a lunar calendar? Is it a solar calendar? Is it both? We don't have anything actually in the Tanakh to indicate that the calendar used by anybody living in the biblical period was a solar calendar. We definitely know that there was a lunar involvement, right? Because on your new moons, we've got a holiday that you're supposed to do every month on the new moons. Okay. But we don't really know if there was a solar element to it or if they just had seasonal shift for a while, right? That's one of the big problems with the Islamic calendar is it is a purely lunar calendar and it gets out of sync with the seasons. So Ramadan moves around, right? In a way that Passover doesn't. Passover is always in the spring. We've never had a situation where Passover shows up in the fall. Ramadan can do that. Month names we don't have, except for that thing Aviv, right? Numbers says first month. Exodus says, well, Aviv is the first month, but no one calls the first month of the Jewish calendar, the Hebrew calendar, no one calls it Aviv, except Exodus. Aviv just becomes a season name. The book of Esther uses the name Nisan for the first month of the biblical calendar and calls it the first month. It does that with the 12th month, which is Adar. That's the holiday that Purim happens in. And Ezra does it as well. So we're going to see a thread here. The month of Sivan is mentioned in Esther as the third month of the year. Kislev is mentioned as the 9th month. It's mentioned in Nehemiah. It's called the 9th month in Zechariah. So all of these books that we're mentioning are post-exilic books. They're books that were written after the Jews went into the Babylonian exile, and really after they went into exile and came back. So that's a really big clue as to how we get the names of the months that we get. They're not Hebrew names. It's not like Ezekiel is running around, or Isaiah or Moses are portrayed as running around talking about these Babylonian month names, because they're Babylonian month names. We do know that some kind of lunar calendar was at work. So these are made from animal antlers. They're from two different archaeological sites in the Judean desert, so south of Jerusalem. Tel El Farah, this is from Tel El Farah, this is from Tel Aroer. This Tel El Farah plaque, if you count the peg holes, you'll find that there are 30 holes, which is a really good sign that we had a lunar calendar, because the lunar month is never more than 30 days, right? The lunar cycle is never more than 30 days. So this is tracking which day of the month you're in, right? And the idea is you'd have a peg and you'd move it 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This one, off on the right from Tel Aroer, has the 30. That's the 3 columns on the right, the 30 peg holes. These are just to hang it, I think. These are ones up top. And then we have this off on the left-hand column. There are 12 peg holes. 12 months in a year, 30 days maximum per month. So maybe these top peg holes are to tell you when it's a leap month. I don't know. We don't have a lot of information about how that worked out. These are, I want to say they're Bronze Age 2, right? So they are pretty old. They are from sites that are associated with Phoenicians or with other Canaanites. They're not Israelite sites. So you kind of do a lot of, okay, well, the Israelites did, the Canaanites did this, and this group did that, and this group did that, and they all are kind of speaking a language that basically is Canaanite. That's Hebrew is basically Canaanite, so probably they're all doing the same thing. But this lets us know that people were definitely tracking the moon for their calendars. And then they have to deal with the moon getting out of sync with the seasons. But, you cross that bridge when you get to it. So we got the Hebrew month names, the Jewish month names, from Babylon. So here's the order of the months in the Babylonian calendar and in the biblical/Israelite calendar. Nisan is the first month, Iyar is the second month, Sivan is the third month. Oh, sorry, hold on. We'll get to Lucy in a second. So Nisan is the month in which Passover occurs. That is not a Hebrew name. That's Arach. That's what this top word is in Assyrian. Arach Nisanu. The month of Nisan. Arach Aru. Iyar Aru. Sivan Simanu. There's some weird shift between V's and M's out of Akkadian into Hebrew. I didn't do enough research to know what's going on there, but it's a thing. Tammuz, Arach Dumuzu, right? So you can see the sounds are coming across. Av in Hebrew, Arach Abu. Elul, Arach Ululu, right? So you can see, okay, well, the names are just coming out of Babylonian, getting a Hebrew version. And you can see which god each of these months is dedicated to, right? These are the names of Babylonian gods. So Bel, Ea, Sin, Tammuz, Gilgamesh. Yeah, that Gilgamesh, the Epic of Gilgamesh, that's that Gilgamesh. Ishtar, Shamash, so that's the sun god. Marduk is like the national god of the Babylonians. Also Mordechai. Ishtar, for that matter, and Esther. Right, so you can see that we have all these god names, and they had a floating 13th month, which was, we call it Adar 2. They called it Arach Makarusa Adar, dedicated to the god Asur, but Arach Makarusa Adar, the second month of Adar. Right, so we do Adar 2 with a Roman numeral after it. It's the second month of Adar, and they intercalate the month in to get their lunar calendar adjusted up with the solar calendar. So I've got that word intercalated. You'll see intercalation later, and that just basically means we're sticking another month in. So the first month, so Kathy asked, the first month isn't at Rosh Hashanah or the New Year. We'll get there, because the answer is both yes and no, which just lets me feel like a lawyer again for a moment. The answer is both yes and no. There is a article that if you feel like punishing yourself, you can read. It's available online on Google Books. From an 1892 issue of the Journal of Biblical Literature. That's the academic journal for the Society of Biblical Literature. SBL is still around, JBL is still published, but this is old enough to be public domain. The names of the Assyro-Babylonian months and their regions, i.e. which god they're dedicated to. And it spends a lot of time going through how we get the names of the months and which god it's associated with and how that came over into the Hebrew months and the Hebrew calendar. So I didn't make it up. It's in this guy's article. It's a tough read. It's not a fun read. It's an academic article from the late 1800s, so it has all of the problems that come with an academic article from the late 1800s. Opaque terminology and transliteration schemes and, more highfalutin language than we're accustomed to seeing even in academic writing today. So I'm not saying go out and read this thing. I'm just saying I got it from somewhere. So how did we get the Babylonian calendar? This is where Lucy comes in. We don't know. We know that at some point we're seeing the names of Babylonian months in the Hebrew Bible, and we know we're seeing it post-exile. Past that, we don't know. Probably they just took the month names over. There's no document that says, on day X, we decided we were going to use the Babylonian calendar as our own. You don't find that kind of thing in the ancient world. And if you did, if you found a manuscript out in the Judean desert that said that, most scholars would think it's a fake because that's way too convenient. We don't know. We just know that it's already done. That process is largely complete. And for some Jews, right, I have that at the bottom. And there's a reason I have that at the bottom. So we're talking about a lunar calendar. How accepted or widespread is this parallel between the Jewish and Babylonian calendars? You will even find, so Roberto asked, how accepted or widespread is the parallel? Like, do people accept that this is how we got Hebrew month names? The names of the Hebrew months. Even Chabad accepts it. That's how widespread it is. There's an article on the Chabad website. Why do Jewish calendar months have Babylonian names? And they explain, they took month names over. Don't worry about it, right? It's okay. This was supposed to happen. But there is an article on the Chabad website where the Ask a Rabbi column that they have that says, why do we have Babylonian month names in our calendar? So even Chabad recognizes, yep, this is what happened. Month names came over. So it's a lunar calendar. It's got adjustments with a month that's thrown in to get us a calendar that stays seasonally stable generally. We'll talk a little bit about how that process works in a few minutes. It's, as you can imagine, a little bit complicated, and a little bit math involved and a little bit astronomy involved. But first, you need to know that this lunar calendar wasn't inevitable. This wasn't the only way Jews measured time. This wasn't the only way Jews had calendars in the year. So there is a Dead Sea Scroll. When you see a number and then Q and then a name or a number stuck after it, like 4Q Brontologion, which is what this is called, or 4Q318, 4 is the number of the cave, Q is the site, Qumran, And then an identifier for the scroll comes after. So this is cave number 4 at Qumran, 4Q. 4Q 318. It's the 318th scroll, just by random identification or order of find. It's the 318th scroll that came out of that cave. Sets out a 364-day solar calendar, naming the months after the constellations in the nighttime sky. Right, so on the 13th and the 14th, Cancer, and the 15th and the 16th, Leo, and the 17th and the 18th, Virgo. There's dispute among scholars of the Dead Sea Scrolls whether this calendar was ever used. And if it was used, how long it was used. Some people say, it really didn't get used as a calendar to organize the community, assuming there's a community at Qumran, which is a little bit of an assumption. So some people said, it was never really used as an organizing calendar, but we have a Jewish community measuring time by a solar calendar. And doing something very interesting with it. So brontologion, I mentioned this down below, brontologion means study of thunder in Greek. So this is not just a solar calendar that's synced up to the constellations. It's a solar calendar synced up to the constellations that tells you if there's thunder at a particular time, this is what the thunder means. So this is, a lot of scholars would tell you something like the Dead Sea Scrolls community was a very traditionalist, conservative, radical group. Maybe, but here's a scroll that says we also believe in omens, right? If there's thunder in the sign of Gemini, fear and distress from foreigners. This is a fragmentary scroll, so we don't have everything. This little lacuna here is because there's a hole. I can't give you the whole line. The whole line's not complete. But it's kind of pointing out there are Jews who used solar calendars for something. The Dead Sea Scroll community is really idiosyncratic in terms of how they kind of organize everything. They are largely rejecting the priests in Jerusalem, and so lots of what they do is tied to that kind of rejection. And so it's not surprising that they're using the solar calendar and saying that the people in Jerusalem with the lunar one are wrong. This is kind of normal stuff for the Dead Sea Scroll folks. More inevitability. There are other lunar calendars in the Jewish world. So the Karaites, which I misspelled there, Karaites are depending on who you talk to, are a group of heretics from Rabbinic Judaism, or are originalists who are properly rejecting Rabbinic interpretation. That's what they would say they are. Or, there's lots of theories about how Karaism, that's being a Karaite Jew, how Karaism came to be. They still use the same method of determining the calendar that was in place before the rabbis. So we should explain. Once the real center of gravity in the Jewish world left the land of Israel and moved to Babylon, so 5th century CE. Once that happened, the authority of the rabbis in Israel to determine the calendar weakened. What they used to do was literally sight the moon and figure out when the new moon happened, and they would send messengers out and say, oh, it's the next month. Oh, it's the next month. Oh, it's the next month. The Karaites still have people living in Israel who watch the moon. They don't use calculations the way Judaism since really the 6th century has used just a calculated calendar. They don't do that. There's somebody in Israel who watches and makes sure that it's a new moon and then sends that message out. We haven't talked about how leap years are figured out in the current Jewish calendar. The Karaites figure out their leap year, when to add a month of Adar. Literally, they go out into a field and look at barley and go, how far has the barley grown? If the barley has not grown tall enough, we need another month, and they add it in. So that decision is made ad hoc every year by the Karaites to make sure that they're seasonally in sync. And it works, right? They're pretty close to the regular Jewish calendar. They're not very far off. It's a few days, give or take. But they don't calculate any of this. They watch for the moon, and then they go out and they look at barley in the spring, before spring comes, and go, oh, barley's not grown high enough yet. We need another month of Adar. The Samaritans, so this very small sect up in the northern half of the state of Israel, near Mount Gerizim, so north of Jerusalem. The barley-based calendar is a little bit Punxsutawney Phil. Mike says, yeah, but they're like taking a ruler and measuring the growth of the barley and going, oh, need another month. So it's not like Punxsutawney Phil watching his shadow. I mean, you get a little bit worried about it, but they're kind of using a ruler. This high to a pig's eye. That's maybe not a pig's eye, right? Because they're Karaites, so they're no two pigs. But you know what I mean. The Samaritan calendar is still determined by the Samaritan high priest. This guy, it's a guy, because it's the Samaritans, right? The Samaritan high priest has just continued to make the determination by whatever secret process the Samaritan high priest has used for generations. He is the most recent Samaritan high priest has recently said, okay, we'll use a computer to help. But twice a year, he checks the computer results. So they're still making the determination in a very traditional, passed down from one high priest to the next kind of way. They're not calculating. They're not necessarily citing the moon. We don't really know what they're doing. They're doing something, but only the high priest knows. And the high priest passes it to the next high priest, who passes it to the next high priest, right? Secret religious knowledge held by religious leaders, right? So we've had the calendar we know, except the first month is in the spring and not in the fall, which we're going to come back to. We've had a look at a Dead Sea Scrolls calendar that maybe was used, maybe wasn't, maybe had just a specialized usage, but that was clearly a solar calendar with 364 days. We have the Karaite calendar, which functions like pre-calculated Jewish calendars did, with the little extra addition of, okay, we're going to see how the grass grows and make a determination on the leap year based on that. And then we have the Samaritan one, which probably is lunar because they use the Torah too, but the details are unknown, right? Nobody's telling us exactly how they make that decision. So those are four Jewish calendars that we can kind of put our hands on. How do you make this work? So how do you know how many days are in a month? We know that lunar months usually have either 29 or 30 days. But if we're not watching the moon anymore to decide the months, we're not relying on somebody sitting in Israel and going, okay, now send messengers out, which is how it used to work. If we're not doing that, how do you figure out how long a month is if you're not actually watching for the moon? What do you do about a calendar that could shift away from the months really easily, right? If you've got 12 months and you've only got 30 days, very quickly you get seasonally out of sync. What do you do about that? Observation was used until the end of the Sanhedrin in Israel, right? Somebody would go and look at and go, oh, new moon today. It's a new month. Then calculation was used. So we have a calculation that gets used. The discrepancy between what was observed and what was calculated is the reason for 2-day holidays in the diaspora. I don't want to call it epistemic uncertainty because that implies something way bigger than it actually is, but there's uncertainty, right? Well, we don't know if it's completely in sync with the land of Israel, so we're just going to fudge it by saying holidays should be a day longer in the diaspora. Rosh Hashanah is 2 days in the diaspora under this calendar instead of one. Why? We're not 100% sure we got the calendar right. Yom Kippur does not get extended. Fast days don't get doubled, but the first and last day of Passover, you get an extra. First and last day of Sukkot, you get an extra. Shavuot, you get an extra, right? These big holidays get an extra day. And it's because we're not really sure that they match up. Even though in Israel they also now calculate the calendar. So this whole thing is kind of silly at this point, but it's what rabbinic law isn't necessarily about scientific fact. So the calendar still does things that we know we don't need to do anymore. Like we can cite the moon and calculate it pretty easily. So how do we know what to do? How do we know how to make the calculation? Maimonides to the rescue. There was confusion until 1180 when Maimonides wrote his Mishnah Torah, this collection of Jewish law that sort of solidifies Jewish law. And he writes a book. Among the books is Halachot Kiddush HaChodesh, laws concerning sanctification of the new month. Most of this book is about how to do the calculations to figure out how many months you need in a year. Do you need 12 or do you have to have that 13th month? How many days are supposed to be in those months? 29 or 30, which month? And just to kind of give you an example of the amount of detail that he starts with, the months of the year are lunar months. The solar year exceeds the lunar year by 11 days, approximately. Hence, whenever this excess accumulates to about 30 days, somewhat more or less than 1 month is added, and the year is made up of 13 months and is called a leap year. The year cannot consist of 12 months plus several days because it is written months of the year, implying that the year should be reckoned by months and not by days. Okay, so this is the beginning of a very long discussion of how to make the calculations to create the Jewish calendar year after year after year. I'm going to answer the question that probably somebody is thinking, did you read all of that? No. I did not. It's a lot to read, and you get through about half of it, and then he says, oh, but actually all of that only applies when we're watching for the moon. When we do calculations, we sort of use the same principles, but now we're going to change it. And there's 13 or 14 chapters to this book. I did not read the whole thing. Maybe I didn't do my homework. It's okay. I'll just use a computerized calendar. Adding a month by calculation is called intercalation. So what the Karaites are doing, remember I said the Karaites decide whether to add a month by going and measuring barley growth. They are very explicit, the Karaites are, in telling you that what they're doing is not intercalation because there's no calculation involved. This is them going out and looking and saying, we need another month for the barley to grow. And adding a month into their calendar. So they will tell you, no, we're not doing intercalation. There is a American Karaite movement. There are 2 or 3 prominent websites, and one of them does really go into some detail about how they determine their calendar. So they didn't just make it up. I didn't go to Wikipedia. I went to this website, and an American Karaite explained their process. So Maimonides says, here's what you do. Here's all this calculation. And he goes into the astronomy behind it. Because remember, he's educated in Greek astronomy, which is pretty good at describing the movement of the stars and the planets and the moon. Right? He thinks the Earth is in the middle of all of that, so not everything is good, but he does know how the constellations move, and he can figure all of that out. So the math is good on his end. When the fixing of the new month used to be based on the observation process, the sages calculated with great precision. The beginning of this calculation that we calculate by approximation is called the molad, but the main principles that we calculate at a time when there is not a court to set it are what are called Ibor. So, right, we've got technical terms to describe each of the calculations. The lunar year consists of 12 months totaling 354 days, 8 hours, and 876 parts. But the leap year, consisting of 13 months, totals 383 days, 21 hours, and 589 parts. Okay. Did Maimonides come up with the 13th month? So Roberto asked, did he come up with the 13th month? No, he did not come up with the 13th month. What he's telling us is how to calculate for it now when we're not basing everything on somebody sitting in Israel and observing the new moon coming and going. So he says, when you have a regular lunar year, this is how many days and hours and parts. That's parts of an hour. You can tell these parts are not minutes or seconds, right? This is a different number. The leap year is longer. Here's how much longer it is. And I said, he keeps going. How do you calculate leap years? How do you know when a month is full, 30 days, or lacking, deficient, 29 days? Like I said, he goes on and on. We're not going to go on and on about figuring out how to do it. But I told you that there are like 13 chapters for all of this. This is a lot of material. You don't have to read all of that to know what to do about the Hebrew calendar. This URL down here, wikibooks.org, Wiki Computer Programming Hebrew Calendar, has a series of rules for allowing computer programmers to figure out whether the Hebrew calendars that they're generating are valid. And it's really handy for describing the rules without having to read Maimonides. And so it says, hey, there's a 19-year cycle that provides the schedule for leap years, telling us when we have to add in those months. 19-year cycle, no big deal. We know when the cycles start and stop. The cycle that we are in began in 5777, so October 2016, because Rosh Hashanah was really late that year. That cycle began in 2016. We're in the 5th year of it, so this year we did not have a leap month. Next year we will. Last year we didn't have a leap month. The year before we did, right? So you can see we are actually in... This cycle works every 19 years. And all you're left to do, that cycle tells you when to add in the leap months. All you're left with is figuring out which months will have 29 days and which will have 30. And there are rules for that, based on whether you're in a leap year cycle or not, based on when certain holidays will fall. So there's a rule that Rosh Hashanah can't fall on certain days of the week. Off my top of my head, I can't remember them. But one of the outcomes of the rule is Yom Kippur can't fall on a Thursday. Or rather, can't fall starting on a Thursday night rolling into Friday. Because if Yom Kippur starts on a Thursday night, you can't cook for Shabbat. And you're not supposed to not eat on Shabbat. So you can put Yom Kippur on Shabbat. You can put Yom Kippur the day after Shabbat. But you can't put Yom Kippur the day before Shabbat because nobody can cook. That's a problem because then you're really not celebrating Shabbat the right way according to the rabbis. So one of the outcomes you try to avoid by jiggering with the year, with the number of days in a year and when the months start, is that outcome for Rosh Hashanah and for Yom Kippur. So like I said, it's complicated. There's rules for variability. It's actually a small number of days that you play with, but it's complicated enough that you don't want to make your own Jewish calendar. Fortunately, you don't have to. If you need to generate a Jewish calendar and you want to put in yahrzeit dates for your family members or birth dates or whatever, there's a website called hebcal.com. Go to hebcal.com, put in the dates that you want to track. It can give you Hebrew dates for the secular dates you enter. You can even load it into your Google Calendar or your iPhone's calendar or whatever. Or you can use the CalJ app on your iPhone or Android device, right? So you want to know what's the Torah portion for this week, you can use that app. You don't have to know how to do all of this. But it's useful to know how we got to this strange state, which is it used to be based on observation. They figured out they couldn't just like watch the moon because the Mishnah from 200 CE describes how the change in the month was communicated. And if you've seen Lord of the Rings, you have an idea as to how this got calculated. There were torches on the top of hills, and when the rabbis said it's a new month, somebody would run to the top of the first hill in Jerusalem and light the torch. And then the next guy down would see it and light the torch. And these torches would get lit up and down the land of Israel, and that's how people knew it was a new month, which doesn't work when you live on the other side of the Atlantic, right? There's a delay. So once you get too far outside the land of Israel, okay, we don't do that anymore. We calculate, and you're going to add a day to your holidays. Nobody does this anymore. Everybody calculates now. In the parts of the Jewish world that are descended from Rabbinic Judaism, which actually includes us, right? So we're not running around following halakha, but we key off of a lot of the stuff of Rabbinic Judaism, right? We're not calling up the Karaites and saying, what's it like in Israel right now? Oh, it's a new moon? Okay, great. How's the barley doing? We're not doing that, right? We're going to hebcal.com like everybody else, or we're getting our calendar from American Jewish World Service or Hadassah or whoever, right? We're all doing what other people do too. So you don't have to do the math, but it's interesting to see where it comes from, which is frankly Babylon, right? The Jewish calendar isn't just a Jewish calendar. The Jewish calendar, the holidays are Jewish holidays, but the pattern comes from Babylon, comes from the Canaanites. We've just assimilated in ancient Near Eastern practice and continue doing it after most of the civilizations that generated it are dead. Which is how a lot of Judaism works, actually. So this is our calendar. If you're numbering months with the order of the biblical calendar months, right? First month is Nisan. When Passover occurs, the last month is Adar. When Purim occurs, we intercalate in an additional Adar, right? That second Adar, which leads to all kinds of interesting conundrums, like, hey, so what if you have a relative who died during Adar 2? Conundry. Mike, is that actually right, or are you just giving me another variation? So what happens if you have a relative? Okay. So what happens if you have a relative who dies on Purim when there's an Adar 2? Because Purim happens in Adar 2. What do you do? When is your yahrzeit? When you're not in a leap year, right? This is the same kind of problem that people have in modern society. I'm born on February 29th. When's my birthday? Right? Am I only 4 years old? And I'm only a year old every 4 years. So the answer the rabbis come up with is, okay, well, you're going to do it on regular Adar, fine, whatever. And then they say, but what about somebody where it's in Adar and there's a year where there's a leap month? Some Jews will do it on the first Adar, some Jews will do it on both. So you could end up observing a yahrzeit twice, depending on your practice. You get all kinds of weird problems from this adding in a month thing. Just like you get all kinds of weird problems from adding in a day every 4 years. All kinds of other problems than just the fact that there are presidential elections on those leap years, because that's its own problem. But, people, like, February 29th is my birthday. When's my birthday? Is it February 28th or March 1st on all those other years? Maybe I didn't get any older. I don't know if that actually works, by the way. I don't think that works. So that's our calendar. But we haven't answered the question of why Rosh Hashanah happens in the 7th month, right? That's a question that we still have floating out there. How did that happen? I have an answer. The Tanakh says the first month of the year is Nisan, when Passover happens. The rabbis say, we're going to complicate things. There are 4 new years. On day 1 in Nisan is the new year for kings and pilgrimage festivals. So this is when we restart the calendar for Passover, Sukkot, and Shavuot. On day 1 in Elul is the new year for livestock tithes, but Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Shimon say on day 1 in Tishrei. So let's rewind briefly. Here's Elul, the month right before Tishrei. So this is the month right before Rosh Hashanah. So now we're really confused because we had a new year in month 1. We have a new year in month 6, maybe, and we have a new year in month 7. If you're not confused by now, I'm not doing a good enough job. Hang in there. Let me see if I can confuse you. On day 1 in Tishrei is the new year for years. Now you know why we have Rosh Hashanah in Tishrei. It's the new year for years and for Shemitah, which is the 7-year, every 7th year you release debts and all that other stuff. For the Shemitah year and for Jubilees, which is the 50th year or maybe the 49th year. The rabbis haven't actually figured that out. For planting and for plants. All right, so this is the new cycle for planting and all that other stuff. On day 1 in Shvat, so we've now talked about Nisan, Elul, Tishrei, and Shvat, which is the 11th month. On day 1 in Shvat is the new year for the trees. Per the school of Shammai, the school of Hillel says on the 15th day therein. So we have now talked about the first day of Nisan, which isn't a holiday other than Rosh Chodesh, but is 15 days before Passover. We've talked about a new year for livestock tithes, which you maybe didn't even know was such a thing. That happens a month before Rosh Hashanah, except there are a couple of rabbis who say actually it's also in Rosh Hashanah. We have Rosh Hashanah, the one in Tishrei, and then we have what we recognize today as Tu B'Shvat. That's this last one, on day 1 in Shvat. Like 99% of the time, if Shammai and Hillel disagree, you go with Hillel. There are a limited number of things Shammai wins on. Some of them are extremely technical. We're not going to worry about them. Hillel won on this. Tu B'Shvat, 15th day of the month of Shvat, is the new year for trees, which is different from planting and plants. So that gets us to Rosh Hashanah, right? That answers kind of the question. We've got a new year for years. We've got a new year for pilgrimage festivals and the new year for kings. So you kind of have to arbitrarily pick a year for the year of a king, and this is how you do it. So a king becomes king whenever, but really the first year is determined by Passover. So in the first year of King whoever, this is the rabbi saying the first year means before Passover. So Larry says 2 for Tu B'Shvat is the 15th, right? So that's Tet Vav is 2, which in Gematria, in the numbering system that gets assigned to Hebrew letters, adds up to 15. Why is it Tet and Vav? Because actually it should be Yud and Hey, but then you have a problem with divine names, and so we don't want to do that. This is how we end up with 2, and for that matter, we end up with Taz, which is the 16th day of something, Tet Zion, because you don't want to have Yud and Vav next to each other either, because that's a no-no combination from the I'm really concerned about divine words perspective. So let's pause here, because this is a tremendous amount of information, and I can't tell you it's intentionally confusing. It just is. It is confusing. It's not intentionally confusing. It's just calendars are difficult. We have questions.
Yeah, I have questions.
Okay.
Uh, First of all, what do they do in Israel? Do they start their calendar with or is their I assume their calendar is different from ours. Do they
Nope.
start it with no?
Nope. Everybody in the world calculates now, except Karaites and Samaritans, right? So Jews living in Israel, their calendar is the same as ours. They just don't have the uncertainty built in that creates the 2-day holidays.
And by their calendar is the same as ours, you mean our Jewish calendar. They're not doing
Right.
okay.
Right.
And secondly, does anyone still do that extra day of Passover?
A lot of people do. I don't know if you'd find a lot of humanistic or reform Jews who do,
Yeah,
but conservative Jews will do 2 days of Seder at the beginning and 2 days of Seder at the end.
but
Some conservative Jews, Orthodox
does their
Jews.
holiday last 9 days, or is that days 7 and 8? One and two.
So their holiday lasts 8 days.
Okay.
The biblical holiday of Passover is only 7 days long. So
Oh,
the eighth day gets tacked on to kind of deal with the fudge factor.
okay. And that's my last question. The fudge factor for Yom Kippur not falling on a Thursday.
Mm-hmm.
So they have to just kind of jiggle the calendar days each year to make that. I mean, that
No,
just
so the calculations that do all of this deal with that too.
okay.
I'm not giving you the full calculation algorithm because I don't know why I would do that to you. Um, but there that is calculated out. So you can go to if you go to hebcal.com, it will give you 200 years from now.
Right.
It's not because somebody's entered in the data for 200 years out. It's because the calculation keeps working.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Thank you.
Yep. Jack, you've got a virtual hand up.
Um, Maybe you'll get to this in a moment, but why did the rabbis come up with this elaborate business of four different New Years for different purposes? Why not leave well enough alone and have Nisan, the month of Nisan, be the first month of the year?
Um, so there's a couple of pieces to this, and I don't actually have this built in because I figured somebody would ask this question, and I was right. So there are a couple of pieces to this. One piece of it is because we're keying off of the Babylonian calendar. Babylonian civilization had 2 New Years. It had, because it recognized two chunks of agricultural cycle, because they were in roughly the same place that Israelites were. So they recognized that they had a growing season that really ran from, March to about September or October, right? So months 1 through 6, 1 through 7. And then they had another New Year recognizing the cycle of the year that was not the growing season but was the rainy season, right? So they said, first 6 months of the year, growing season, second 6 months of the year, rainy season. We're going to mark that change in the seasons by having a holiday that they called essentially Rosh Hashanah. So they had a new year in the spring and they had a new year in the fall. Therefore, we have a new year in the spring and a new year in the fall. We brought Rosh Hashanah over. There seems to have been an existing holiday on the first day of that seventh month. It seems to be there because Yom Kippur is coming. That seems to be why there's a holiday of any kind at all. Rosh Hashanah is not called Rosh Hashanah in the Torah. It's just called on the first day of the seventh month, you will have a big Shabbat, a Shabbat Shabbaton, just a big Shabbat. Because 10 days later, Yom Kippur is coming. That day is called Yom Kippur. So there seems to be some kind of recognition in the Torah that you need a holiday at the beginning of this big month because there's a big holiday coming up. We assign Rosh Hashanah to it because we're able to kind of integrate in these Babylonian practices. So that's how we get Rosh Hashanah in the 7th month. You had to assign some kind of significance to this day that otherwise is just called the Shabbat Shabbaton, right? Big Shabbat, or a day of blowing the shofar. That's the other name given to Rosh Hashanah in the Torah. No holiday name in particular. These other two, the one in Elul and the one in Shvat, we don't 100% know where these come from. They're not in the Torah. They seem to be connected. How would I put this? We're close enough to April 15th. These are tax days. That's what these are. These are tax days. So the Shvat, the one that we know as Tu B'Shvat, happens kind of in the dead of winter with reference to certain kinds of fruit trees. And you're thinking to yourself, in the winter, trees don't bear fruit. To which I say, I grew up in Florida. Let me tell you, when oranges come out, they come out in the winter. Many of the fruit trees in Israel, particularly orange trees, generate fruit in the winter, and you got to tax those. Citrus trees produce fruit. Sometimes at this time of year, that's when you tax them. What are you taxing? You're taxing the tithe for the temple. You got to figure out how old trees are, because trees of a certain age can't be taxed. Trees after a certain age must be taxed. So you're just kind of setting a random birthday for everything. The same is true for livestock. You need to know when to tax livestock, because livestock that's below a certain age you can't use. Livestock above a certain age you can use. You need a tax day for it. It gets assigned to Elul because the month of Tishrei has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 days designated for special sacrifices. We kind of have Sukkot as a kind of an afterthought in our modern calendar. But if you look at Sukkot in the Torah, Sukkot in the Torah has the largest number of animal sacrifices of any of the holidays. It's astounding. Like, hundreds of animals are sacrificed on those 7 days of Sukkot, plus an 8th day. That's what Shmini Atzeret is. And you need to know which animals you can use for that. So let's put it the month before, the big month when you need to have those animals ready, because you've got to transport them. Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Shimon are saying it's on day 1 of Tishrei, right? They differ on when that should happen. And they differ on when that should happen because they think, oh, you can get it all done. So we should just not invent holidays here if we don't have to. But you need tax days when you're operating a temple, when the temple is kind of the seat of government and religion. That's how you do it. You create some tax days. The New Year's listed don't correspond to particular holidays necessarily, right? So Rosh Hashanah is the only one that's indisputably on the first day of a month. 7th month of the biblical calendar. First on the creation-oriented calendar. We're going to talk about that too. Passover is the 15th day of its month. So that New Year's Day on the first day of Nisan, right? Passover is the 15th of Nisan. That first day, it's not a holiday. You just, you got to know when the month starts. Tu B'Shvat is maybe not on Tu B'Shvat if you're from Shammai. So a new year for the trees is actually in the middle of the month. It's not on the first day of the month. Right? Tu B'Shvat is the 15th day of the month. That's when we're saying the new year for the trees is, because it's a tax day. This thing we do with Tu B'Shvat Seders and all of that stuff, That is not biblical. That's not rabbinic. That starts with Kabbalistic Judaism in like the 1200s, right? Comparatively modern. This idea that Tu B'Shvat's actually a holiday that we do something about. And the livestock tithes is on the first day of Elul. Some people want to say Rosh Hashanah, but we don't listen to them because they're in the minority these days. This one in Elul, Rosh Hashanah Shel HaBehemot, New Year for livestock, Tu B'Shvat and Rosh Hashanah Shel HaBehemot for the trees and for the animals are not in the Torah. They're not there. They are administrative creations. We don't actually 100% know whether these days were the days. Or how long they were the days. We don't know if the rabbis were making this up or had some strange memory, because there's not a really full description of these particular things. Josephus doesn't spend a lot of time in the first century telling us about the tax days in the calendar. So we don't really know. The rabbis are talking about it, and we can see the rabbis actually don't disagree, which suggests that maybe the rabbis made some of this up. And that's what we're living with. And I know everybody is now shocked. Wait, the rabbis made something up? The rabbis made some stuff up. Any other questions? Anybody have steam coming out of their ears like a Warner Brothers character at this point? I can't see your faces, so I don't know if you're saying yes or no, by the way. I can't, because I'm trying not to get your faces on video. Joyce.
So if and this is ignorance, clearly, I don't have one of these calendars in the house. If I'm getting a calendar today, it's going to start with Rosh Hashanah?
If you get a Jewish calendar today, like you go online and you order a Jewish calendar, it's going to start with Rosh Hashanah. Yeah.
Okay. All right. And then in a couple of years, it's going to have an extra month thrown in.
Next year, yeah. So the year that we are going to begin on Labor Day,
right?
Because that's when Rosh Hashanah is this year. That year is going to have a leap month in it. So 2022, we're going to have an Adar 2. Early next American calendar year. Why is the year 5781? Yeah, I've got answers for that too. Ami, yeah.
Yeah, you can tell sometimes by the dates of the holidays when is the next leap year will happen. This year, because everything happened so early, with Rosh Hashanah starting September 7th, which is as early as it can come, then you know that next year will be a leap year, because it cannot go any. You cannot afford to lose another 11 days when it happens late. Then it may take another couple of years until you have the leap year.
Yep, it is exactly as wild as that. So we're getting questions in the chat. Okay, so did we get the year from the Babylonians, and why is it 5781? Well, we are going there. What does 5781 mean anyway? The way we usually are presented with this is that this is the 5,781st year after the world was created. That is usually, it's sometimes called Anno Mundi, right? Year of the world in Latin. Maimonides didn't use Latin. Don't worry about that part. That is in fact not accurate as a description. It is, of course, more complicated, because you knew this was going to be more complicated. We can't even get the months straight without complications. So the years are going to be weird too. So let's do the years. The year 5781 is actually 5,780 years after creation, according to the rabbis. Because we start counting the years in the rabbinic calendar with year 2. Now you're going, well, what are you talking about? Okay. there is no 0 BC, right? There's 1 BC, there's 1 AD, there's no 0 BC. You can't have a year 0. The rabbis also didn't think you could have a year 0. They also have decided, this is all midrash, right? This is a thinking process that has nothing to do with anything that anybody could measure. They said, okay, Rosh Hashanah is a Shabbat Shabbaton. Rosh Hashanah is a Shabbat. It took 6 days to create the world, and on the 7th day, Yahweh rested. Yahweh rested on Rosh Hashanah. Because the word describing rest is Yishbot, which sounds like Shabbat because it's the same root. So they decided that the 7th day of creation, according to Genesis 1, was actually day 1 of year 2. The 6 days of creation preceding it were the final 6 days of year 1. And all the other stuff in year 1, it's actually called the year of Tohu Vavohu. Tohu Vavohu is the Hebrew in Genesis 1 to describe the state of the world before the creation of lights and the firmaments and all of that stuff. And it means void and formless or something. So everything in that year 1 up to the last 6 days is formless and void. It's the year of formless and void. So 5781 is actually 5,780 years after creation, according to the rabbis, because the first Rosh Hashanah was on year 2. The first day of year 2. So that's why 5,781, but that doesn't answer why that number. We are not getting that number from the Babylonians. We're not getting that number from anything other than Jewish texts. So there are 2 specific midrashic works, Seder Olam Rabbah and Seder Olam Zutah, which you will almost certainly never read because there aren't good translations. There aren't good full translations of these. Seder Olam Rabbah means Seder Olam, the order of the world. Rabbah means the big one. Seder Olam Zutah. Zutah is an Aramaic word that means the little one or the younger one. So Pliny the Elder and Pliny the Younger, right? Seder Olam the Elder, Seder Olam the Younger are engaged in the same process. They open the Torah at Genesis 1 and they start counting up years and adding things together and generate a timeline based on reading the Torah, reading the rest of the Tanakh, and harmonizing and syncing things up and figuring out what the apparent redundancies and contradictions mean. And they calculate out a time frame that determined how old they believe the world was as of the completion of that work. Maimonides then took those texts and ran with them to figure out what the year was at his time. And said, this is year, we're going to see, year 49, something, something, something. That's this year. We're starting from this year. That's how we're going to count the years from now on. So not only did Maimonides figure out how to do the calculations for the year and really solidify them in the Jewish world, he figured out the calculations for what year it is, right? So he's figured out the calculations for the months, and he's decided for everybody in the Jewish world what year it is. So without Maimonides doing the work that he did, we might actually still be counting to things like the destruction of the temple, which is how a lot of the rest of the Jewish world counted until Maimonides said, we're going to count from creation because we know when creation was because we have Seder Olam Rabbah, and I think they're right. So we should look at a little bit of Seder Olam. We're actually looking at Zutah because it's a nice summary paragraph. And the writer of the text says from Adam to the flood is 1,656 years. And in another paragraph, he portions out Adam was X number of years old, and at age X, based on some Midrashic tradition, is when this person was born, and then we start to just chain them out like a family tree. So from Adam to the flood is 1,656 years. From the flood until the separation, Abraham from Ur, but what they're really talking about, Haflagah, they're actually talking about the Tower of Babel. From the flood to the Tower of Babel is 340 years. 1,956 year after creation. And from the separation of the languages to Isaac is 52 years. That's 2,048 years. And then from Isaac until Israel left Egypt is 400 years. And then 40 years that Israel was in the wilderness. And then 850 years from when they came to the land until they were exiled. There are 70 years of exile in Babylon between the first temple and the building of the second temple. By the way, that number is wrong. The building of the second temple stood for 420 years. That's 3,828 years after creation. We know the second temple was destroyed in the year 70 CE. According to secular calculations, Jewish calculations put it at 68 CE. So there's going to be a 2-year differential coming up here soon. And then the stuff in brackets, from the destruction of the temple to now, the publication date, is 1,053 years, and all these together are 4,881 years after creation. Okay. This last sentence is actually a copyist's insertion, so we're not going to spend any time with it except to say it's wrong, and every subsequent version of this text knows that it's wrong. Because this text exists, this text is quoted by 804 CE, and it seems to date itself to around 1120. That can't be right. Somebody copied it and added a sentence in. And copying and adding sentences in is a thing medieval scribes did. They just did. We have to live with the fact that they mess text up on purpose. So Barry says, how do Karaites and Samaritans calculate what year it is? The Karaites are relatively close to how Seder Olam calculates things out. Samaritans, I don't know. That's kind of the answer. But for sure, the way the Jewish world calculates the calendar, 3,828 years after creation is 68 CE. So that's when the Jewish world has sort of set its calendar to and said, we know that this is, the second temple was destroyed 3,820 years after creation. How do we know? Because the people who wrote Seder Olam Rabbah and Seder Olam Zutah sat down and calculated it out with a Torah scroll in front of them. That's how we know. Meaning we don't know, right? They've just decided. Educated guess based on assuming that everything in the Torah is true. Maimonides very helpfully says, I'm going to use this timeline. We've already said these procedures we're explaining in the laws are for sighting of the moon exclusively. Right? We're 11 chapters in, we're still talking about what happens if you have people living in Israel looking at the moon. From the beginning of the fifth night, blah, 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 blah. Okay, this is all very confusing. This is what we want to see in bold. That is the year 4,938 from the creation, which is the year 1,489 for contracts, which is the year 1109 from the destruction of the second temple, and that is what we are calling the base year in this calculation. So he's saying, this year that I am writing this is where we're going to do our calculations from for our calendar months. 5781 minus 4938, which is what he wrote in the Mishnah Torah, is 843 years. 2021 minus 843 is 1178. That's within 2 years of the Mishnah Torah, which is 1180. But when you remember that Maimonides thinks the temple was destroyed in 68, that's your 2-year difference. So this is Maimonides telling us. This is the year we're starting from. Had Maimonides not put this in the Mishnah Torah, The Jewish year would still be based on a contract year or destruction of the Second Temple or whatever. This is how we get 5781. Somebody decided they had calculated out how old the world was, and we had a fixed date that we knew we could assign to the destruction of the temple and counted forward from there. That's how we get 5781. Maimonides decided he was going to set the whole Jewish world to his clock. Successfully, right? Because that's what he did. So it's complicated, but questions on that. You could very legitimately ask the question, okay, if we know that this isn't really how the world was created, why as humanistic Jews do we continue to use this calendar? Nobody's asked that. I'll ask that.
Why do we?
Why do we? Because we're still Jewish. And there are things that we know don't work, but we continue to use in order to be able to talk to everybody else. And this is one of those things. That's the answer. Sometimes you accept that the language you use is imprecise and weird. Larry.
When I was in the regulatory world, the mantra, and we set standards for things like securities trading, how to calculate interest, which wasn't mathematically exactly correct. We were challenged. We would say a standard is not the truth. It's just a standard that everyone uses. So if the rule says the interest is $163.28, that's what it is for everyone, buyer and seller.
Yeah. Standards aren't always exactly right?
Like standard time.
Right. Let's not even get started, right? How imprecise is time, actually, right? So that's a mess, too. Mike says, can we find some historical thing that happened 5,781 years ago? I don't think we can calculate things quite that precisely is the problem. I mean, the Bible definitely thinks it knows when things happen, but...
As Monty Python would say, the birth of Shlomo.
The birth of Shlomo. Yeah, we don't even know when that happened, right? You know, it's a mess. So we're just kind of picking an arbitrary number and working with it because that's what the Jewish world works with. And the reality is most people in the Jewish world go, no, that's not how old the world is. But it underlines this saying, from Moses to Moses, there was no one like Moses. This calendar stuff would continue to be a mess had he not decided that he was just going to help people not have to study Talmud so much anymore by writing the Mishnah Torah and saying, I know what it should be for the whole Jewish world, which is really what he did. So, remember Maimonides was talking about how, let's see if we can find that. I'm sorry I'm flashing through so quickly. The lunar year consists of 12 months that are days, 8 hours, and 876 parts. Leap years have 21 hours, 589 parts, right? So how does he know how many hours and minutes are in a year? How do you count that? How do you know what time of day it is without an Apple Watch? Or Big Ben? Or the Swiss? Or, Casio or Seiko or whoever? How do you know what time it is? What's the tool that everybody used to figure out the time?
Well, like sunlight and shadows and
stars.
Right. Sundials, right? Does that mean that every hour on a sundial is exactly the same day in and day out, year through year? Is the 12-hour day always exactly the 12 hours that we're accustomed to working with now? Not on a sundial. Rabbinic Judaism requires prayer 3 times per day, morning, afternoon, and night. It has limits on what morning is, what afternoon is, when night is, and when you can say those prayers. So you actually need to be able to tell time in order to follow halakha, to follow Jewish law on these prayer times. And you need to be able to do it in the first century when you don't have a wristwatch or a clock tower. So how do you do that? More complicated. The rabbinic day has 24 hours. 12 are considered day, 12 are considered night. Morning is the first 6 hours of the day. Afternoon is the last 6 hours of the daytime. Why 24 hours? Why are there 24 hours in a day? Right now, why are there 24 hours in a day? Where do we get that from? In Western society.
Babylon.
Babylon? Ah, someone's been reading Herodotus. Close. Geographically close, chronologically not. Egypt. This is the very first sundial that anyone has found. It dates to about the year 1500 BCE, or the 19th dynasty in ancient Egypt. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. And now you know why there are 12 hours in daylight and 12 hours at night. Because the Egyptians decided it was 12. They do have some sundials that are 10, but they stuck with 12. Why 12? It was common.
More numbers than, it's equally divided by more numbers than 10 is.
Correct. It's equally divided by more numbers than 10 is, and it divides up other numbers that are higher as well. So 12 was just common in the Middle East. 24, these multiples of 12 were common in the Middle East. Herodotus says, we got sundials from the Babylonians. That's where we get our 12-hour days and our sundial. Well, the Babylonians probably got it from the Egyptians, or everybody just kind of hit on it on their own. Why 12? What if you don't count on your fingers? What if you count on your knuckles? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. 12. That's the counting convention. Because then you can go 1, 2, right? That's 3, 6, 9, 12. Why 60 minutes? Babylonians like base 60. They like base 60 because it worked really well for calculating diameter. Or did you think pi was a really good way of calculating things? Right? If you just did Euclidean geometry from high school, would you ever get a precise circumference to a circle? Everything would have pi in it. That doesn't work. Base 60 calculations worked well for geometrical purposes for figuring out circles. So the Babylonians used a base 60 calculations, circles divided into 60, and that's how we get 60 minutes. And conveniently, 60 is a multiple of 12. 5 times 12 is 60. So it worked with a round clock to be able to use 60. This is why we have 60 minutes.
Oh, and so 360 degrees for a circle.
Yeah.
It's all related.
Right. So the degree measurements come from the Greeks, but where did they get the base 60 thing from? We got it from the Babylonians. They did get that from the Babylonians. Right. There's a lot of we teach Euclidean geometry in school, and so a lot of our brains automatically switch to pi notation, but the Babylonians didn't use pi notation. They used base 60, and they were able to get precise measurements on all kinds of circular things. If you've ever watched any of those weird aliens constructing pyramids shows, anybody watch those? The Discovery Channel and History Channel used to have them. And one of the things that people will say is, well, it must have been aliens. It couldn't have been ancient Egyptians because everything's a multiple of pi. All the sides of pyramids are lengths that are multiples of pi. You know how they measured length? They had a circle, like a wheel, on a stick, and you had a mark that told you when you'd gone around one rotation, and so you'd start and you'd walk and count the rotations off. That gets you lines that are multiples of pi. There were no aliens. It was just geometry. So we have 12 hours of daytime, 24-hour days, but they're variable because they're measuring against daylight. So hours 1 through 6 are in the morning, morning Shema and Amidah, preferably before the 6th hour. Midday is not called noon, it's called Chatzot, which just means halfway mark. Hours 7 through 12 are sort of the afternoon because we don't use noon, right? It's just after the midday. The afternoon Amidah is recited here, and you need to know what halfway through that period is, because if you recite the afternoon Amidah before 9.5 hours are up, then you can tack on the evening prayers afterward and you don't have to do them at night. This seems incredibly unimportant until you go to somebody's Shiva. At which point, you will discover that they try to run the afternoon and the evening Amidah together. And you need to know that rule in order to make it work. Yes, I have done that before. I have had to figure out that time period. That's very nerdy stuff. When is midday? When is that Chatzot point? It depends. So I told you there's an app called CalJ. This is 2 screenshots of CalJ off of my phone. I took it yesterday. You can see. So this tells you what time frame I was in the halachic day. Midday yesterday for the Jewish timekeeping system was 1:15. This is March 24th, so a few days before Passover. Midday is 1:12. So it moved 3 minutes. The day started at 5:58. That's the first light of dawn. Calculated. It's 5:58 yesterday. Next week, it'll be 5:43. This means that the number of hour minutes in an hour in the halachic calendar that people use to set their prayer times, hour minutes are not the Jewish calendar's minutes. Our hours are not the Jewish calendar's hours. That's all relative to the sun. So that adds another complication, right? How do you know what time it is? The Jewish day starts 72 minutes before sunrise and ends 13.5 minutes or 18 minutes, depending on your rabbi, after sunset. Maimonides says 18, for what that's worth. Start and end of the day vary based on the sun. That's why Shabbat candle lighting times move too. The standard clock time, midday, changes based on the length of the day. The hours of a Jewish day can range from 77 minutes long in the summer to 42 in the winter. Like hour minutes, depending on where you are in the world. And it means that holiday and Shabbat start and end times vary throughout the year and from year to year. Rosh Hashanah will not start on the same time this year as it did last year, because they'll be on different secular calendar days, right? The solar calendar, it's in a different place. The lunar calendar, it's in the same place. So there's a lot of variability in all this timekeeping stuff because you have to keep time without mechanical watches and an international agreed upon standard, and there's no atomic clock at an observatory someplace that you can set your cell phone to, right? If you're on AT&T and you look at your cell phone, it's 9:03. There's no 9:03 in the Jewish clock. You're guessing based on the sun. Okay, so questions?
Yeah.
Yeah,
So do people who follow, who pray all the time and follow that whole schedule, do they actually do it at each one of those different times by the day? And how do you live your life like that?
You use a cell phone app. So what you do, so what actually happens, people do roughly know when the days start and when those times are. There's a fair amount of leeway in each of those time frames. So if you are going to do morning minyan, for example, the synagogue can set morning minyan for like 8:30 in the morning, and that'll be pretty good throughout the year. Some people might not be doing it as early as they want to, but okay, if we set it at 8:30, that's going to work all year round, because the day never starts after 8:30 in the northern hemisphere. I mean, maybe like if you're in the far northern reaches of Iceland or something, but I don't know who's worried about that. The Chabad rabbi in Iceland probably. But other than that, in New York, 8:30 is a pretty safe time. The afternoon one, in theory, moves a little bit. What you will find in places like New York City, where there are observant Jews, is that they will set up an afternoon minyan frequently in the workplace or right down the block from a lot of workplaces. So if you worked in the Empire State Building up until a couple of years ago, there was a reliable afternoon minyan for you at J. Levine Judaica store. If you were in J. Judaica store in the afternoon when afternoon minyan started, and you weren't a man, they were going to kick you out of whatever room they happened to be doing minyan in, which was frequently the book room upstairs. So they set that to a time in the afternoon that will continue to work throughout the year. And then evening is evening, and you kind of have a pretty free range of time in which you can do evening. It's just, kind of after sunset, and you've got a long time frame in which to do it. So it is livable and manageable. There are iPhone apps that will give you notifications that you can set. So your phone buzzes you to say, okay, you've got an hour before the time for morning Shema is over. You've got 15 minutes before Plag HaMincha is over, and you can't double up Mincha and Mariv, more afternoon and evening prayer. That's how people manage it. Is we have our leashes, and our leashes buzz us with the times, and for Orthodox Jews, many of them, their leashes buzz them with prayer time too.
So can I ask why you said that was true until a couple years ago?
Because J. Levine closed.
Oh, there you go.
That's why. J. Levine was basically like a block away from the Empire State Building.
Yeah.
But they closed recently, along with a lot of other Judaica stores in Manhattan. Manhattan is not fertile ground for Judaica stores anymore, so it's too expensive to be there. So you got to go to Brooklyn. Which, okay. Other questions?
I do think it's interesting that they're using our time to figure out their time to do things. Like it's a comparator. It only works that way when you have.
Yeah, and it's really because our timekeeping is so standardized that it's able to happen, right? If we didn't have a very standardized way of timekeeping, everybody would still be looking out the window and kind of going, what time is it, right? But mechanical timekeeping is, as opposed to solar timekeeping, is what enables the little pop-ups to happen. And it's only when you have to start worrying about syncing up kind of that more nature-oriented timekeeping mode with a standardized timekeeping mode that you realize how complicated it actually is to make those adjustments, and how complicated it is to live in a system where you don't have a mechanical timekeeping standard. Because imagine recalculating your calendar without... You can go online and look 200 years in the future with that Hebcal website. Imagine having to wait for the local rabbi to tell you when the year was going to start and stop, right? Because the calculation is too difficult for most people to do. Because you need to know Greek astronomy, Greek math, Arabic math, right? Like, you need all of these different skills to be able to do that math. Plus, you need to be able to understand what Maimonides is saying in Hebrew in order to make any of this stuff work. So, yeah, it's kind of a disaster. And you just are reliant upon printed books. So there is actually a book you can buy that has the Hebrew calendar in print for the next 100 years. Which is, a lot of rabbis just keep it on their desk because they need it. Particularly the ones who are going to look up calendar dates on Shabbat because they're not going to use their phones. Right? An Orthodox rabbi is, if asked, is not going to take out his cell phone on Saturday morning. He's going to say, "Oh, I have the book in my office. Come with me. You want to know 20 years from now what it is? I can do that. I need that book." Because they're not sitting there doing the math either.
That doesn't count as work. Okay.
So we should talk about what work means. Because we think we are... The pitch that is given for Shabbat is, you deserve a break from work, right? 7-day work week is terrible, so you have a day off from work. I don't know if you've tried to keep Shabbat as an observant Jew, but if you have, it's not exactly easy. It's not exactly not work. It's just work that you're doing in a different way. You're just not doing productive work that changes the world around you in the same way. But I've got to tell you, for people who study Torah all the time, it's not that you take a break from studying Torah on Saturday. It's just that you're studying different Torah. You're still working. It's still the same thing you did Sunday through Friday. It's just you're looking at a different thing because it's Shabbat, so you shouldn't be reading the same thing that you did the rest of the week. The word Shabbat doesn't mean rest exactly. It means to desist. As in desist from the stuff that you were doing before, not, okay, I'm going to take a rest now and sit down on the couch. We pitch it as though that's what it means. If you read Abraham Heschel's book, The Sabbath, he pitches it as like the Sabbath is literally says the Sabbath is a palace in time. Those are the words on the page at one point. Well, yeah, if you're pitching it to modern people who are looking for a break, I guess that's what you say. That's not really what happened.
What was it that God did when Saturday rolled around?
God, according to the Torah, God stopped what he had been doing.
He did something else.
Doesn't say what he did. It doesn't say he rested. It said he desisted from the work that he had been doing.
He waited for the Sunday times.
That's right. waited for the colored comics, the colored in comics as opposed to the black and white ones that come with the weekday newspapers. I guess. So Mike says he's not excited about the number 5781 or using Jesus's birth being as problematic for non-Christians. Should we start a new system for the Anthropocene? I mean, you could start one and see how it goes for people. I don't think it would be popular. I'm willing to be wrong.
There's a guy named Stuart Brand who's doing a thing called the Clock of the Long Now. It's like a 10,000 year clock. Like each tick of the clock is 10,000 years. So maybe it would go with that sort of thing. I don't know.
Is that the Stuart Brand from the Whole Earth catalog?
Yeah. He wrote an interesting book about that. He's trying to stretch out our sense of time because geologic time and the human time doesn't connect,
Hard to keep track of our day-to-day time that way, though. Right?
And the clock is going to be built inside a cave in Nevada or something like that.
What is it with philosophers and caves? It's very Plato. Other questions? It's fair for you still to be confused. So if you have confusions, I'm happy to answer questions. I will make sure that my face is the only face on the video, and we'll post that to YouTube so that it can be looked at again and you can confuse yourself all over again. And I will see everybody at other times. There will be Shabbat this Friday for those inclined towards Shabbat on Fridays. Passover is coming. Machar's Passover Seder will be on March 28th. So that's the next big thing. And then we're going to start in on the holidays, beginning with Passover. So we'll follow the biblical calendar, mostly because Passover is the next holiday, starting Tuesday next week.
Thank you.
So, good night, everyone.
Good night.
Thanks very much.